So as I was taking a break from creating my second metaphor and epistemology video that's more centered on Jordan Peterson and how he answers the God question, I watched a little bit of Paul Vanderklay, and he referenced this Joe Rogan experience video with Elon Musk. And so I decided to watch some of that in my break, and I think it is deserving of some commentary, particularly when he starts talking about the simulation theory of reality. And I think it fits in well with my ideas about metaphor and epistemology, and even with how I am trying to figure out Jordan Peterson and the God question. I think it plays a role in that too. So I'm going to play some of the interview here with Joe Rogan and Elon Musk and comment on it as I find relevance to this material.
It will be, at some point, indistinguishable from reality.
Where we'll lose this. We'll lose this. Like, you and I are just looking at each other through our eyes. I see you, you see me, I think, I hope.
You think so?
So here Elon says that as long as we are progressing in our ability to simulate things in games, for example, to simulate reality, the physics of reality and so forth, no matter what the increment of progression, even if it's 0.01% per year or per decade or whatever you have it, eventually that will get us to a perfect simulation of reality. And so he's trying to suggest to Joe that while Joe may think that they're sitting here in reality across from each other at a table, looking at each other with human eyes, as Ian McGilchrist would say, there is a betweenness between them and their human abilities to understand each other through nonverbal cues and through all sorts of things is there. But what if they're not? What if this is what if all of that is just a simulation? And to what degree does that even matter? And for a long time, I've been the oddball among my friends who was always a proponent of, let's say, the Matrix. And I always would be the one who would say, I don't care if I'm living in the Matrix. As what's the difference? If I don't know there's a difference between the Matrix and the real world, what would it matter? It's something to think about. That's just where I happen to fall on it. Anyway, so we'll move on, because I don't think Joe quite understands his point coming up.
So
I think you probably have regular eyes.
This could be some simulation.
It could. Do you entertain that?
Well, the argument for the simulation, I think, is quite strong, because if you assume any improvement at all over time, any improvement, 1%, 0.1%, just extend the time frame, make it 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years. The universe is 13.8 billion years old. What would civilization, if you count it, if you're very generous, civilization is maybe 7,000 or 8,000 years old, if you count it from the first writing. This is nothing. This is nothing. So if you assume any rate of improvement at all, then games will be indistinguishable from reality. Or civilization will end. One of those two things will occur. Therefore, we are most likely in a simulation.
Or we're on our way to
exist.
one, right? Well, but just because we exist, we could most certainly be on the road.
See, I don't think Joe understood his idea there. Because we exist, because we understand that eventually there will be such a thing as a simulation of reality that is possible, therefore, and we also understand that it's either that or the end of the world, because the world has not ended, therefore we must be in a simulation ourselves. I don't think Joe understood that. And I've heard Elon explain this in other places, and other philosophers explain this in other videos. And I read a little bit about it myself as well. It's a hard argument to refute because of just the probability of it. And I think that's what Elon Musk is saying. He doesn't know for a fact. Obviously, no one can know it. but the probability of this being the case seems rather high when you think about it the way he's thinking about it. And Joe goes on to say that maybe we're just on the road there, we're not there yet. But once you realize that there could be a simulation within a simulation within a, and so forth, it just goes all the way down, sort of like the movie Inception. The number of simulations compared to the actual base reality, it's like you'd be like winning the lottery to be in base reality, because you're that 1 in 300 million of the simulations that you're actually in base reality. And 300 million is probably an infinitesimally small number compared to the number of simulations that are likely being run of base reality. Now, to me, the interesting thing that Elon Musk says here that I haven't heard before is the nature of the base reality, let alone, because everyone seems to like to talk about the simulation, which of course is fun and interesting and exciting to think about, the idea that we're not in the real world. But this is a very old idea. I believe Plato had it in his cave, that people are just seeing what we actually experience are just the shadows on the cave wall. I think Paul in the Bible says that reality that we see here is more like a reflection in a mirror or off of a pool of water. There is a sort of a sense that reality is a poor creation of recreation of what actually is or was. So, for example, in the Bible, the idea is that we're fallen creation. The original creation was quite a bit better. So I'll just keep on playing here until we get to that part.
We could be on the road to that, right? It doesn't mean that it has to have already happened.
We could be in base reality. We could be in base reality.
We could be here now on our way to the road or on our way to the destination where this can never happen again, where we are completely ingrained in some sort of an artificial technology or some sort of a symbiotic relationship with the internet or the next level of sharing information. But right now we're not there yet. That's possible too, right? It's possible that a simulation is one day going to be inevitable, that we're going to have something that's indistinguishable from regular reality. But maybe we're not there yet. That's also possible. That we're not quite there yet. That this is real. When I touch that
feels
wood,
very real.
Maybe that's why everybody's like into like mason jars and shit.
Well, now they go off into a tangent about the mason jars. That's not entirely relevant. But Elon doesn't seem to want to argue the point with Joe, because what's the point of arguing that to believe that you're in the true base reality is like believing you're a winner of the Powerball or lottery or something. But I have another video open here that's to the part where they pick it up again into something that's more interesting about the nature of base reality according to Elon Musk.
Are you a proponent of the multi-universes theory? Do you believe that there are many, many universes, and that even if this one fades out, that there's other ones that are stark?
Now, I read an interesting book by Max Tegmark. He's a physicist and mathematician, and I think it's called The Mathematical Universe. And so he is a proponent of the multiverse, and it's quite a thing of contention in physics, because the way Tegmark explains it, there are things that that follow from from the math that they use in physics, and so it cannot be tested. You cannot test it in the traditional scientific way, so it cannot be falsified. Okay, and that's the strength of science. So traditional physicists do not believe in the multiverse, because it is something that is unscientific. It cannot be falsified. You cannot test it. Now, some people say, well, maybe there is a way to test it, and we're going to figure out a way to test this. Now, I mean, well, I'm open to the evidence. Let's see what happens there if they can figure out a way to test it. But so far, the way I understand the theory and the way the traditional physicists understand the theory is that, it is theoretically impossible to test. So if it's not possible to test in theory, it's kind of hard to imagine that it's going to be possible to test in reality, so-called reality. But we'll see where that goes. But now Tegmark is part of the class of physicists that totally believes, and perhaps it's because he's also a mathematician, and I believe his father was a mathematician, believes in the math, and where the math leads, he follows, whether it can be falsified or not. And so traditional physicists sort of take that to be like talk of angels, of God, of something, of religion. Tegmark does not. He does not equate it to that. He does not believe that he is believing in something without sufficient reason. For him, the math is the reason. And so, like I said, where the math goes, he will follow. And the math, according to him and others like him, the math points to the multiverse, that there is such a thing, as you'll hear Joe and Elon talk about, multiple universes.
Starting fresh right now, and there's an infinite number of them. They're just constantly in this never-ending cycle of birth and death.
I think most likely, this is just about probability, there are many, many simulations. These simulations are, you might as well call them reality, or you could call them multiverse.
These simulations, you believe, are created? Like someone has manufactured?
They're running on a substrate.
So
that substrate is probably boring.
Boring?
Mm-hmm.
How so?
Well, when we create a simulation, like a game or a movie, it's a distillation of what's interesting about life. It takes a year to shoot an action movie, and then that's all distilled down into 2 or 3 hours.
This sounds very familiar to what Jordan Peterson sometimes talks about when he refers to Dostoevsky. And Dostoevsky, in his novels, distills human experience. This is why Jordan and others like Carl Jung, thought that the study of good novels, good writing, good literature, can enlighten you with regard to human psychology. The reason being is that the writer like Dostoevsky, who's on a scale that maybe 1 in 10 million can be on that level, or even higher odds than that. He has such a mind and such an eye, and such a way of perceiving the world and human beings, that he can take his 30 years of life experience and distill it into a 500-page novel, or some of his novels are more. And from that you can learn about humanity. And so this is sort of what Elon is talking about here, is that we take the best parts, we take the most exciting things, sometimes the most tragic things and so forth, we distill human life into a 2-hour movie or a 70-hour video game. And this is also similar to what Jung was talking about regarding the archetype. It is the extreme of something. And Jung believed the archetype was technically inexhaustible, sort of like a diamond with a million different facet cuts on it. And when you hold it up to the light, you're going to see it differently each time. Anyway, I'll let Elon talk a little bit more about this, and then I'll comment again.
So, let me tell you, if you see an action movie being filmed, it's boring. Super boring. There's like lots of takes, everything's in a green screen. Looks pretty goofy.
So he's saying, again, base reality, if we were to experience it, would be lackluster compared to what a simulation might be like. Because as we are familiar with creating things like movies and games and books and plays and all kinds of other things, we create them with, we imbue them with higher levels of creativity and imagination and fun and tragedy and excitement and everything. We pour it in there for that concentrated experience of life. Whereas in reality, the reality moves very slowly compared to how a play might, or an opera, or a movie. A 2-hour movie can cover vast periods of time in a person's life, where in reality you have to wait 20 years to see something unfold properly in someone's life.
Doesn't look cool, but once you add the CGI and have great editing, it's amazing. So I think most likely, if we're a simulation, it's really boring outside the simulation. Because why would you make a simulation that's boring? You'd make a simulation way more interesting than base reality.
That is, if this right now is a simulation.
Yes.
So I think it's an interesting take to think that the base reality is more boring. I think another way of looking at it, and I think Blake had the opposite way of looking at it. First of all, we are in time. So the qualia, the experience of time, is something that is a limiting factor for us. So when we want to make a movie or a book or whatever, we only have a limited experiential piece of time to create it and to enjoy it. Whereas in eternity, and this is hard to think of eternity without the concept of time, and Blake hated that kind of constraint, but let's say you can imagine eternity without time. There is no such constraint. So maybe in that regard, you know, from taking the perspective of a being in time, eternity would seem boring or unexciting. But you'd have to admit that that is just your bias as a being in time. When you have eternity to, I mean, let's try to make some equivocations or equivalences. Let's say you enjoy a certain meal at a certain restaurant with certain friends. You have a great time for 3 hours. And it was exciting for you, and it was enjoyable, and it was fun. And all the food tasted delicious, and the drink was amazing. In eternity, there isn't that limit of 3 hours. So what might a meal with friends, what would the equivalent be like in eternity? I don't know, but it's interesting to think about. I don't think it would be more boring. And again, I think I would only think that because of my bias as a creature that is in time. And I think the Bible also goes into the idea that, you know, obviously we are fallen creatures in a fallen world. So our world, as let's say it's the simulation, the fallen world versus heavenly eternity, our fallen world is actually a lot worse, and it's always less than the original creation, or let's say base reality, or whatever you might think base reality is in a supernatural kind of sense. And Blake goes into this as well as Northrop Frye, saying that, you know, we have imagination to think of how things could be otherwise. So, you know, we could imagine ourselves being stronger, faster, smarter, to have better vision. In Fearful Symmetry, Northrop Frye says, for example, quote, "Our sight is feeble compared to the lynx, our movements stumbling and foolish compared to a bird, our strength and beauty grotesque compared to the tiger. Once we begin to think in terms of wish and desire, we find ourselves beating prison bars. Our desire to see goes far beyond any telescope. We are ashamed of our bodies, and though the shame itself is shameful, particularly when we realize that they are the forms of our souls, it is there still, and it is hard to love a creator who could, for instance, make our places of joy and love excrementitious. We are fearfully and wonderfully made, but in terms of what our imaginations suggest we could be, we are a hideous botch. The man who does not use his imagination is the natural man, and the natural man, according to all versions of Christianity except deism, can do nothing good. Yet what does the imagination do except reveal to us our own impotence? And I would say myself that it reveals to us our fallen nature, and that the world is not, as Elon Musk says, that much better than it could be in base reality, but that it's that much worse here than it could be in base reality. We have the imagination to imagine exactly how much greater heaven could be, how much greater paradise could be, and how we could make it so. So I think Elon's idea is very interesting, and I think I'm going to let him speak a little bit more about this, because he goes into it a little bit more, and I have a little bit more to say about it.
And ultimately, inevitably, as long as we don't die or get hit by a meteor, we're going to create some sort of simulation if we continue on the same technological path we're on right now.
Yes.
But we might not be there yet. So it might not be a simulation here. But it most likely is, you feel, other places.
This notion of place or where is a...
Flawed?
Yes.
Flawed
like
perception.
Where, like that, if you have this sort of, that Vive, you know, which that's made by Valve and Steam, and it's really Valve that made it. HTC did the hardware, but it's really a Valve thing.
Makers of Half-Life.
Yes. Valve, great company.
Great company.
When you're in that virtual reality, which is only going to get better, where are you? Where are you really?
Right.
You aren't anywhere.
Well, whereas
you're in the computer.
What defines where you are?
Exactly.
Right.
It's your perception.
Is it your perceptions, or is it a scale that we have under your butt? You're right here. I've measured you. You're the same weight as you were when you left.
Now here, Joe is taking the materialist perspective, and Elon is sort of questioning the validity of the materialist perspective, because although we base our materialism on our perceptions, all of the perceptions, as Descartes famously said, could be fooled. And fooled by what? A demon or a god, or as they're discussing here, an alien technology, or perhaps it is our own technology that we, as far as we know, have not yet invented. And this is also very important to William Blake, the idea of perception, and the idea that perception is part of creating reality, not absorbing sense data and accepting reality. That we are active perceivers, not passive receptors. A passive receptor of sense data is something like a camera, a machine. But the human eye and the human brain is more active in perception and helps create the reality that it perceives.
But meanwhile, your experience is
why do you think
different.
you're where you are right now? You might not be.
I'll spark up a joint if you keep talking. Your manager's going to come in here. We might have to lock the door.
The other thing, and I'm going to end with this, where Elon talks about the movie set and how when you're watching the movie set, when you're watching it be made, it seems boring, but once you see the actual movie, it's much more entertaining and exciting. In the same way, and I think he has sort of the thing, it's a very interesting analogy, but I would reverse it also, in that when you look at the simulation and you look at the movie, let's say the old Western looks very nice. There's a fully functional downtown with a bar, a brothel, a general store and whatnot. But as soon as you peek behind the set, the store fronts, you see it's hollow, it's two-dimensional. There is no behind the storefront. There's only a few set rooms that they created. The bartender only has 3 lines of dialogue and can say nothing else. You see, it's almost like Westworld in some ways. But Westworld is a more fleshed out set, but ultimately hollow reality. So that is the simulation. That is the fallen world. The unfallen world would be where you could peek behind the storefront and there would be a full store. There would be living human beings that can say more than 3 lines, that have creative power, that have imaginative control, not just reason. This came up a lot in Paul's one of his last videos, and it's very much a part of C.S. Lewis, and I want to do a video comparing C.S. Lewis maybe and Blake. I think they're historically at odds, but they don't have to be. That you have imaginative control over your reason. Your imagination governs how you use your reason. So, for example, in the Jordan Peterson versus Sam Harris debates, Jordan wants to make sure you don't use your reason to rationalize, as they did in the Soviets and the Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany, to rationalize hell on earth. That's how you don't want to use your reason. And to just say that reason sort of separates us from the animals and makes us supernatural, which I think there is something to that. But I think the greater that there's a step missing is that the first step is that there's imagination which separates us, and then it's the linking of our imagination with our use of reason as a tool. And perhaps there are two tools that we use. Maybe there's another thing going on there. And one is perhaps more leaning towards the left hemisphere, and one leans perhaps more towards the right hemisphere, as Ian McGilchrist might point out. But anyway, I thought I'd just make this short commentary because I don't have too much time in between preparing my other videos. Like I said, I did this metaphor and epistemology video. It seems to be doing very well for my channel, and I'm doing sort of a spiritual successor to this video, and it's going to be more centered on Jordan Peterson and the God question. So if you like any of this, please like and subscribe. Thank you.